American politics seems to be particularly angry these days. Why? A new book attempts to answer that question. We're joined now by its author. Peter Wood is president of the National Association of Scholars. His book is titled Wrath, America Enraged. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I don't think it's a secret to anyone that people are pretty angry when it comes to politics these days. You look at the history of this and say this is not just something that cropped up over the past couple of years, but something that's been building for decades?
Yes, I try to take this back to the era around the end of World War II. Before that, America had a very pronounced, explicit ethic that said that self-control was far more important than expressing your anger. That people who got angry too easily, too often, or too violently were to some extent stigmatized. They were told this was not the right way to lead your life and there would be penalties if you did, social penalties. After World War II, two things arrived in the United States, mostly on the coasts. It took a while for them to sink in. One of them was the advent of Freudian psychoanalysis, which taught elites anyway, that anger repressed would come back at you as neurosis. So for the sake of good mental health, you should let it all out, express your anger in the moment. The second thing that arrived nearly at the same time, but quite differently, was the European existentialism, the notion that to lead an authentic life meant to be fully in touch with your feelings and especially to be angry. Those two things fused together for some people anyway in the 1950s. We had books like The Catcher in the Rye about an alienated teenager who eventually finds himself on the shrink's couch confessing his anger. We had poets like Ginsberg expressing in very vulgar terms his hatred of America. The Beat Generation was one access point to this kind of anger, but it really took another generation for that to reach out into a broader public. In the 1960s, we had a lot of angry protests. The movements for social justice, as we would now call it, took up anger as an instrument by which they could advance their agendas. And this became something of a lifestyle for at least a minority of people. Anger, however, is one of those emotions that we learn to pattern very early in childhood. So it depends a lot on what kind of parenting is taking place. And the rage-filled protesters of the 1960s were nonetheless children of parents who had brought them up to tell them that being so open in your anger was not a good idea. So it took yet another generation for the protesters to have their own children and to begin to inculcate the idea that expressing anger was empowering and liberating, and you should just go for it. So I won't try to trace this all the way through the generations, but I would say that the cultural change was in the works for quite a while, at least 70 years, which was redeeming anger as a constructive way to live your life. So to the surprise of some people, I think the arrival of anger in our political life came late in the game. It was already part of our cultural life. It was in our entertainment, our sports, our churches, just about everywhere before it became part of our politics. The reason for that is that politics by its nature is always angry. It has opposition built into it. And because of that, politicians and our political institutions have built into them ways to control it, a kind of built-in diplomacy that says you can get angry at the guy across the aisle, but after the day's deliberations, we'll go out and have a drink together. Now that cuts against what I call this new anger, which is volatile, expressive. It's a look at me, how angry I am. It's a show-off anger. And it doesn't play well with politics, or at least it didn't. But that began to change roughly during the Bush administration, George W. Bush, when the political left became pretty much unhinged in its anger and began to try to find flamboyant ways to express it. Well, I think Donald Trump was certainly not on the left at that point, but he was one who picked up on the cultural vibe. In his early career, his television shows were based on a kind of performative anger. So when he became president, we were in a wonderful situation where the left had made a lifestyle out of anger, and the populist right was just discovering that it could do the same thing. And I think that's what gets us to today.
We're chatting with Peter Wood. He is president of the National Association of Scholars, and we're talking about his book titled Wrath, America Enraged. So you've talked about the history, bringing us really up to the present day. How does all of this anger, as it now plays out in politics, enfeeble our politics and stop us from doing what needs to be done?
Well, certainly it impedes, if it does not entirely destroy, the possibility of political compromise. In our party system, compromise is essential. We don't ever get anywhere with major legislation unless you can get both sides to buy into it to some degree. But anger doesn't really like compromise. Anger wants a kind of purity of its position. So it feeds into the extremist element on either side of the aisle. And it gives us this sense of feeling powerful just when we're blowing off steam, really. A viable form of politics allows that your opponents, even though you may disagree with them strongly, have some right to their opinions and should be able to express them. I think the really crucial thing right now, and it's what prompted me to write the book, was that since the 2020 election and since the riot on Capitol Hill on January 6th, the left is essentially denying the right any possibility of legitimate dissent. And that really backs up anger into something far fiercer and I think more dangerous. That's what I call wrath. This wrath that says, I have no place to take my anger with any hope that it will be respected and dealt with. I can't go to the police. I can't go to the courts. I certainly can't go to the mainstream press. What do I do with it? And thereby you get yourself in this position where a kind of outburst is really all that's left. So why does our politics not work so well? Well, maybe there's a way back from this, but certainly it begins with the idea that you just have to find some way to respect your opponents. That's not saying that we're always going to find the answer by cutting the loaf in half and finding a golden mean to it. We may not. Maybe one side or the other will have to prevail when it comes to taking crucial votes, but it doesn't mean that the side that prevails should be trying to grind the other side into dust.
Most of us see a problem. Your book, it sounds like, does a very good job of tracing some of the key roots of this problem. What at this point are you advising, either of the book or outside of it, that we do about it? How do we take the first step toward getting us back on track?
Well, I think the first step to getting back on track is to respect dissent. And thus, when parents show up at school board meetings to disagree with policies promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, or the 1619 Project, they should be heard respectfully. They shouldn't be lied to by school board members who say that's not happening when we all know that it is. I think we need to respect the airline pilots, the air traffic controllers, and policemen and nurses and firefighters who are dissenting from taking their COVID shots. I'm not trying to dissuade anybody from taking COVID shots, but I think we have to find a way to respect those who think that their personal autonomy is violated by rules such as that. Simply demonizing people with whom we disagree is no way in which we're going to get back to a country that respects the consent of the governed in trying to figure out how to best frame laws and exercise proper governmental authority. So those are the simple steps we could take now.
You've obviously written about this. You've been monitoring this situation for a number of years. Do you have much confidence that people are ready to try to look for an alternative, or are people more likely to just keep getting angrier and angrier till there's nothing else left to do?
Well, I think that both things are happening at once. I certainly talk to people who are essentially saying we're in a cold civil war. It's soon going to be a hot one. They expect violence to ensue and are prepared for it if it does. But I don't think they represent the main public stream of sentiment, which wants us to get back to some kind of island of sanity. I'm encouraged by the election in Virginia, which was decided essentially by a centrist and independent vote that came in on the side of the candidate who does not pose as a hothead. He's brought himself into office by being temperate in character. And I think that model might well stir other politicians to realize that it's time to swim back towards a more centrist kind of politics. The repudiation of some of the steps that the Biden administration has taken is probably going to be a necessary part of that. I don't really want to take a partisan position on this, but I think the country is hurting from Afghanistan, the trouble on the borders, the acceleration of inflation, the high cost of energy that we're now facing. All of those things are real body blows against the mainstream of the American public, and you're going to need politicians who realize that and back off from some of the more extreme positions they've been taking.
The book, once again, is titled Wrath, America Enraged. Its author is Peter Wood. He is president of the National Association of Scholars. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Great. Thank you for having me.